And welcome to the Monday Call, brought to you by NZ Funds. I'm Stefan Clark, Chief Client Officer. With over 500 small and medium-sized enterprises in New Zealand, business owners eventually face the question of selling to a third party or passing the torch to a family member. Both options come with their own set of dramatic challenges and potential for great success. This morning, we're speaking with leading experts Daniel McLaughlin, Special Counsel in the private wealth team of Dentons, a leading law service firm in New Zealand and part of the world's largest global law firm. Sam Bassett, NZ Chairman and Director of Moore Markhams, an independent accountancy, audit and advisory firm within the Moore Global Chartered Accountancy Business Network. And Peter Ashworth, Principal and Managing Advisor at NZ Funds Private Wealth. We will be exploring the key factors SME business owners should consider when planning for succession. We will discuss how to prepare a business for handover, run a successful process, obtain the right advice and bank support, appropriately value a business, and effectively manage the proceeds for the future. This is a very tall order, as I discovered researching this conversation in the lead up to our discussion today, given we've got 50 odd minutes and a topic which covers multiple disciplines and is vast in nature. But I thought we should kick off with the beginning, how to think about a transaction and some of the learnings you in your respective disciplines have in going through it with your clients. So my first question, I'd like to direct this to you, Pete. How far in advance should business owners start planning for succession, and what are the first steps they should take?
Interesting. I mean, at its best, the absolute. I've got horrendous echo going on. Sorry, Stefan. Is that happening at your end? Okay, I'll keep on going. At its best, in terms of the best examples I've seen of when they've actually started a succession or started to think about business succession on day one of their business. So when they set the whole structure up, they're thinking about what the future holds for them and how they'll ultimately transition that in the future. But that's absolutely rare. In most cases, I encourage people to, when I'm talking about their broader financial position, we're talking about the range of assets that they hold. And of course, the role that their business fulfills in that overall structure becomes really important. So I'm always talking about the pieces of the puzzle that make up their financial portfolio, and I'm always talking to them about making sure that they're maintaining and building the value of their business. But it's one thing to build it, but it's a transition to the next generation, which is where it becomes challenging. So of course, I always start to encourage a conversation with their accountant and their legal team, and to start that at least 2 years out. So that's kind of the ballpark figure that I would use.
Sam, do you have anything to build off from what Peter said? When do you start engaging with your clients, and what are the key steps that you think they should take in the first instance?
I think, Stefan, certainly 3 years minimum, you should start on the process, and it's probably my accountant's financial bias. I think you need to start getting your house in order, really, in terms of having the financial information that you know is going to be asked for as part of a due diligence process for sale, getting used to a higher level of financial reporting, perhaps, and having monthly accounts and budgets and that sort of information available. Another key one is working on your working capital, reducing your working capital. A lot of New Zealand SMEs that are privately owned are guilty of having rather fat balance sheets, too much money tied up in trading stock and accounts receivable, and that cash cycle of their businesses is growing over time. And so it can be quite helpful to, that would be my key bit of advice, is that you start 3 to 5 years out, certainly 3 years out, and really work on that stuff before you get into a sale process with a broker.
Okay, and so how, you've got to prepare the business practically, and we've got to prepare the business sort of uh, uh, structurally, the ownership piece. How should, Daniel, how do you think owners should prepare themselves mentally and emotionally, and perhaps are there other stakeholders that they need to think about early in the process?
Yes, there certainly are. I think my key advice would be to start the discussions early, and bring the family on board, particularly, say, the next gen, if they're going to be involved. Um, Take them on that journey and see how involved or otherwise they want to be, so that everyone's clear from the outset. Um, but just to go back to your first question about when people should start the process, I do agree with Peter and Sam that it'll take a matter of 3, 5, whatever years to go through a process. But my suggestion is to start now, start the succession planning journey now, because you can never predict when something might happen, whether there's a death, divorce, some sort of distress, mental incapacity, and you really need to plan for all of those, and you don't know when they might happen. So I would start with a succession plan sort of as soon as you can, if you don't already have one, and keep it up to date and review it. And then when it comes time to actually pass the business on, start that process, and it might take, as Sam and Peter were saying, sort of 3 to 5 years. But as long as you've got that plan to start with, it will go a lot more smoother, and you'll be ready for unforeseen events.
And if you don't plan for it, what are the consequences? Because I suspect being suddenly forced to move very quickly through a process that is quite lengthy or can be quite lengthy. Have you seen in your time that one of those events taking place and it causing outcomes that wouldn't be optimal?
Absolutely, yep. A divorce, for example, that can often lead to the business being broken up or the assets sold off in a fire sale situation, which is never desirable. Or if, say, the founder dies and doesn't have suitable succession plans in place, sometimes the children or other family members can end up in court for years trying to sort it out. So having a plan that takes everyone on that journey is really important.
Okay. And then I guess the other piece, and it plays into valuations and so forth, which we'll talk about in future, and this is maybe one for you, Peter, is business owners tend to, when they're transitioning, want to think about the next phase in their journey, and that, most likely retirement. And in order to be in a position to mentally make the leap from the business into the next phase, they have to think about, can they? And should they? So how do you, in your role, answer that question?
Well, once again, we're talking about the pieces of the puzzle, and looking at the current and likely, or the current value of the business and likely future value is really critical. My clients are often really good at and have been reinvesting in their business through the years in many cases, and so they've built up this kind of concentrated risk in the business. And so when they're thinking about the next phase of when I actually turn that into cash, how do I manage that? Firstly, how much do I need in the first instance to be able to fund the next step? And that will often be capital for them. It might be capital, perhaps thinking in a farming situation, where it's distributions to the next generation as well. So, being able to sit down and do some capital projections in that space is really helpful to people. They can see that they can actually achieve their future goals, both their lifestyle needs and the next generation's capital transfer wishes, or they can see whether that's actually going to be possible. And people tend to be very poor at actually estimating how much they need. They either tend to overestimate and think that they're never going to have enough, or they actually maybe are overestimating the value of their business and really need to think, seriously about how they build value before the sale actually occurs.
So once they've got I guess, a number in mind that they think is viable to achieve. So they've built the business up and they're ready for the thinking about in concept, can we make or should we make this succession process or start the process? Typically, people would start thinking about engaging an accountant if they haven't. Business owners would tend to have one, but they might have specialist accountants for this space. They're lawyers, and again, I suspect the lawyers that have supported them along the journey in building the business might not be someone who helps them think about succession or think about the transaction itself. And then obviously there's a financial advisor, which can help guide them in bigger decisions and also managing capital afterwards. How would you describe your role, Daniel, and the role of a lawyer through the succession process, whether it's, at that beginning phase and structuring for it, or transactional? And then Sam, I'd value if you could describe how your role as an advisor along the way and an accountancy perspective supports that.
So I guess my role is to help clients put in place a plan that meets their objectives, but is also suitable for their current circumstances, and then to help them review it as things change or just as time passes. And then, when you come to the liquidity event, help them through that event, but also work with other advisors to get the best result and help the client through that process. I think the best results happen when advisors will work together, get everyone around the table to come up with the best outcome for the clients rather than working in silos. Because I think if you do that, then key things can be missed. And an example might be, say, a lawyer helps a client to set up a structure to receive the proceeds of sale. If you don't talk to the accountant, that could be inappropriate for tax purposes, for example. So I think it's really important to get everyone around the table as early as possible.
Yes, I think you will often have situations. A classic one is where the business owns the premises that it's operating out of, and so you've got that issue of working that through. What sort of lease is going to be in place? You're not selling the land and buildings with the business, or maybe you are, but that's also got quite a risk profile. I mean, what you often are seeing are aging owners of a business, and there's really a huge amount of risk tied up there. There's the reliance on the health of the business to provide the income and pay the rent and investment return on the property that the business is operating out of. And it's important to really start having those discussions with your accountant or financial advisor sooner rather than later, and plotting out what the process might look like financially. And there has to be, I take up Peter's point, that sometimes clients actually can overestimate how much money they need in retirement, or it's talking that through. What's the likely purchase price? How would it be paid out? And then how long, is that going to provide a sufficient amount for the next 5 or 6 years or longer? And then just working through those issues right at the start, because there's nothing worse than finding yourself as a business owner in the middle of the GFC or a real flat patch, and then the classic one that comes along is illness. People are vulnerable, and something comes along, and really you've got to get out quick, and you never want to be in that situation.
Before we launch into sort of more practical discussion points, there's been a lot of talk about baby boomers and the baby boomer hump or lump moving through to the next phase. Are you seeing that unfolding now? COVID seemed to have put a stop on a lot of transactions that may have happened, and now we're we're well past that. And so, in your practices, are you seeing that the hump is now thinking about moving into the phase of succession?
I'll just jump in for a second. Look, for me, the answer is yes. And it's interesting that we're seeing it both across the farming sector and in the more general. It's we've seen this kind of delay, I think, where we have seen people that have kind of got through the COVID period. They're trying to get back onto an even keel now, and they're now starting to think ahead. So that's one group that we're seeing coming through. The other group is, in the farming community, we're starting to see a little bit of stress out there. And that's starting to cause people to think about, well, look, how do I move this to the next generation? So, when thinking about the team that we put around somebody in a succession context, having that banking relationship becomes important as well. And so, yeah, from me, I definitely have seen an uptick. It seems to have been a long-awaited train arriving, but I think we are starting to see it kind of pull into the station.
I could just add to that too, and just comment that we're seeing the same thing. People in all sorts of industries and with all sorts of wealth are starting to have those discussions and think about how to pass wealth on to their children, and they're also thinking about what they'll do with it. Whether they're just going to have a nice lifestyle or whether they are interested in philanthropy or they want to set up some sort of inheritance for their children. So all those discussions are happening right now, and I think they will for the next sort of 10, 20, 30 years as that wealth is transferred.
Sam, is that what you're seeing too in your business?
Yes, it's that post-COVID period, and now there's been you can start to get a handle on what the fair earnings of the business are in the post-COVID environment, and very much so. There are now people actively wanting to exit their businesses. I think it's almost been delayed. There's quite a few family owners of businesses that are 75 years of age, and they've sort of hung on, but they are wanting to get out now.
Yeah. So when you're in that situation, one of the questions that comes up, and we've talked about on the Monday call, we've talked about trust structures in the past, but there are other structures too. Daniel, do you want to just touch on at a really high level, what are the key, sort of ownership structures that support the transition process? And how do you think about when it's right for a particular family?
Well, you touched on trusts, which are obviously very common in New Zealand and have been historically. So that can be a suitable structure in a lot of situations, but in a lot of situations, they're sort of no longer appropriate, or they haven't been run properly, and they're not doing what they're meant to do. But there is still a place for trusts. I guess companies are the sort of next most popular option. I guess the one disadvantage of companies is the assets or the shares are in the person's own name, and so they're vulnerable to creditors. So if there's creditor risk, then a trust is usually a better alternative. But that just really depends on the circumstances of the client and what their objectives are. Are they most concerned about creditor protection, or do they want something that's a bit more streamlined and easier to run? So yeah, it really just depends.
And the trust also lets the settlers decide on and put wishes into place about, for example, how the assets of the trust get passed on to the next generation. And I'm going to butcher the quote, but there's Peter's recently written an article in one of the papers with it, which talks about. And Peter, I'm sure you know the quote I'm referring to about one generation passing it on to the next one, and then they nurture it, and then the next one squanders it. I assume that the trust process can help manage that.
You might be thinking of rags to riches in 3 generations or something along those lines.
Yes, I think that's exactly what it is. Yeah.
Trust can be helpful in that context because it's not necessarily the family or the next gen who are in control of the assets. And we always recommend professional trustees rather than just family members, for example. So that is a good reason to have a trust where there's significant wealth there and the family wants it to be managed for the future generations, because obviously trusts can now last for 125 years in New Zealand, and overseas there's the option to have trusts that are sort of have no expiry. So yes, that is a good place for trusts to kind of have that continuity through the generations.
The vast majority are companies that I come across, Stefan. And there's nothing wrong with a company structure, I think, for sale and succession, particularly if it's combined with a family trust, as Daniel suggests, with a professional trustee. And then you do that balancing. That your classic example will be one of the children or one of the next generation is more actively involved in the business than the others, and then that becomes a key role for that professional trustee to work through a fair, for the trust for the whole family to obtain a fair value over time from the transfer of the business, and with that fair allowance where there is a conflict of interest situation between one of the trust's beneficiaries also taking over the trading business.
Righto. Okay. And so one of the challenges that I guess business owners face is how to decide whether to try an internal succession or and whether that's viable for the business, be it a family member or someone else who, say, management buyout or some other equivalent, or have a third party come in. How do you think about that when you're at the early stages of advising a client? What are there particular points that you draw out with the client, or is it mostly about the money? Sam, maybe this is one for you.
Look, I have to say, if there is a key son or daughter or a couple of family members of the next generation that are actively involved in the business, I rarely see the rug being pulled out from under them, frankly, just because maybe a bit more money could be obtained through a third party sale. Usually, some arrangement is worked through for internal succession. But it can be. Having said that, there are plenty of situations I work with where the family actually sit around together, and if there is an offer that is from external offer that is really exciting, then both generations of the family look at one another and say, "Hey, that we've got to take this. We need to move on," and it all works.
Yeah. Okay. I imagine in the farming community, it probably comes to hit a lot more where there's one person who wants to take over the farm and say the siblings don't want to, and then and then at the same time, particularly a few years ago, there might have been some very active buyers out there, whereas perhaps in other industries, when you're in a particular niche and there's not so many trade buyers, for example, it might be a different scenario. Okay, and how do you think about making a business more valuable and easy to transfer when you're at the early stages? Pete, I know you have some thoughts about this when clients initially start coming to you and helping them explore, well, what do I need to do to start the discussion and make it ready for a transfer?
Yeah, no, very much so. It's interesting that in that early phase, making sure that the professional team that's actually the client has around them is kind of up to the task. And this is maybe sound a little bit harsh, but when thinking about the expertise that are required, especially with business valuation and how active the accountant is in the business, is really important. Is an important thing to look at. Because the reality is that it's the accountant's, a proactive accountant that is a true business advisor can add immense value through this phase, probably more than anyone else. But you've got to have the right person there. And so, I think in general, the accountancy profession is getting much, much better at this. But there are still, you still want to have your A team out there if you're preparing that business. And that's generally, this early phase is kind of led by a proactive accountant. Sam, your thoughts?
Yes, Peter, I agree with that. And the accounting profession now I think we are in general getting a bit better at that, because the actual compilation of accounting information is easier, and so accountants are hopefully working closer with their businesses, talking about this stuff. And I mean, your classic one that I touched on earlier is that a business that's dropping out $500,000 a year profit after a fair return to working owners, that's a lot more attractive to a purchaser if there's not a lot of money that has to be tied up in the balance sheet. But you'll see some of these businesses where, yes, it's making $500,000 return, but there's a $2 million capital requirement on the balance sheet and then, of course, when you start looking at that in valuation terms and things, it's not as flash as the owner might think. And it's important that the accountant has been discussing those sorts of issues with the owners. And because there is a reason why accountants sort of traditionally have banged on about trading stock and stock turn and debtor days and some of those issues, because they do come home to roost when you're wanting to exit and extract value for your business.
I think it's also important to not be afraid to get specialist advice. I mean, if your accountant isn't necessarily up to that particular phase, then source that advice that you need. It's a worthwhile investment.
Yeah. And I'm suspecting that, given you particularly in your role, Daniel, you will be working with clients through the whole journey, but with it, early on, they'll be asking for guidance from you for which accountants you would, to refer to. And I suspect likewise, Sam and Peter would be that. So it's about building a team around you of people that you trust or are happy referring to. Another one that came to mind, which I'd value all of your thoughts on, is policies and procedures and legal arrangements that support a transfer. A lot of small to medium-sized businesses are known for having everything in the founder's head or close to, and someone who's stepping into it and thinking about taking over the business potentially. It's difficult to read people's minds, and so having it written down or having it expressed in some other fashion becomes very important and supports the valuation process. Maybe, Daniel, do you want to touch on how you think about this and what you convey to clients? And then I'll pop down to you, Sam.
Yeah, obviously it's so important to get that stuff written down, not only in the event of a liquidity event, but as I was saying before, you can't foresee risks of private wealth. So if the founder dies, what happens then? Is there anyone who can step in and take over, or did all that knowledge die with them? So yeah, we do encourage people to get those things in writing, but often it's not until there is an event that it becomes a problem, or it comes to light. So, and that's why I say the succession planning process should start now, and that should be part of it.
Yes, it regularly comes up with a business sale, and I often think, gosh, why didn't we get this sorted? But before, we're in the middle of a due diligence, and it comes out that there's asbestos in the roof of the premises or something, and no one had turned their mind to this sort of 3 years ago, and as you know, you're better to confront those things, get them fixed and sorted, because you end up by purchasers don't like risk, I suppose, and so you then end up by a larger adjustment than if you'd sorted out the problem yourselves in an orderly way. And another one that regularly comes up in financial due diligence is contracts. That often things have got quite loose. It happens over time. Some of your key customers that the business relies on heavily, but it's all on trust, and there's very little written down, and that's not ideal, obviously, when you're starting to go through a due diligence process. So those sorts of things are well worth going through, in that 3-year period prior to marketing the business.
Is there anything you would add to that, Peter?
No, look, I really think that it's been nailed. It's just getting that team and the right people. And I must say that both the accountancy profession has got better at outsourcing for specific project work now, and so which is really good. And that the long-term accountant may call in the resources required for this process and doesn't get too kind of parochial about just that, about their client and the loss thereof. So there's some, and I really encourage that type of thinking, because much in the same way as sometimes I'll be brought into some of these relationships initially for a one-off piece of advice. That's the way a good team works. So yeah, I think Sam and Dan have covered it.
One of the other challenges is when to engage with employees and how to share that something's being thought of. Daniel, do you have views on how this is best managed? And I assume it forms part of the plan at some point along the way.
Yeah, this probably isn't really my area, but it is part of the plan, of course. Particularly if you think you might be selling to someone within the business, you want to start those discussions early. But yeah, it certainly is part of the process. In terms of timing, it probably depends on the business, and what the founder wishes to do.
I suppose if there's a surprise event, suddenly the communications happen very quickly.
Whereas exactly. And you don't want to be surprised.
Yeah, well, exactly. Sam?
Look, I understand that it can be important to have a level of confidentiality, because it's very unsettling to team members and the staff team to a business sale. But I'm a little critical, I must say, that I think business owners, in my experience, overstate that, and actually I'm more in favour of a bit more of an open book and taking people into your confidence or along with you on. And in my experience, staff and key team members, key management team members in a business, I actually favour being more open with them as early as you possibly can in the process. I think that's actually preferable than because 9 times out of 10 that you have a very confidential process, and then the cat comes out of the bag. Things find out, and then So anyway, that's my view. I mean, I get it; it can be unsettling to the team, but I'm in favour of a more open book, frankly.
And I guess if you keep it all confidential until the last minute, you risk spooking people, and then you might lose key employees.
Yeah, just to support those two positions, really. The most successful ones I've seen, they take the key staff on the journey with them. I mean, the staff aren't silly. They know the ages of people involved. They know what's going on in the family life behind the scenes in many cases. So they understand that this is coming, and they're a lot more comfortable if they at least have some understanding of what's happening and what the next step might look like. So to me, a lot more risk in keeping it behind closed doors than there is for having some degree of transparency, or at least sharing some information through the process.
Another key stakeholder, and we've touched on this earlier, are the banks, and particularly if banking finance is used within the business as part of its ongoing capital requirements or as part of the purchase. Pete, do you have any thoughts on how that should be looked at?
Certainly, things have changed. When I think of the last 10 years, where the banks were asset lenders, that was fine as long as you had assets. They didn't really care. But of course, they've all become cash flow lenders now. So in fact, having a banking institution that understands the business, understands where its cash flow comes from, all of those things is really, really critical. And at some levels, the old harking back to actually dealing with somebody in the bank that actually understands and knows you can be highly valuable through this process. harder to find in the banking world now, but does still exist. And so, yeah, banking, certainly it's become increasingly important to have that part understood right through the process. But, Sam will understand this better than most.
I suspect it influences valuations. Is that what you're seeing, Sam, and the willingness to pay a price when it's hard to get funding, as it has been more and more over recent years?
And of course, the high interest rates. I mean, at a fundamental level, if you can get a risk-free high return, then that starts to impact the multiples that you're going to pay for a risky SME business. As a generalised, certainly in my career in accountancy, the multiples have come back a bit for SME businesses from when I started out. People are more questioning about paying too high multiples in the New Zealand environment for SME businesses. But having said that, anecdotally, it's in our office. We've seen a lot of Australians interested. It's a classic thing where an Australian larger business will look at a business based in New Zealand and think, that fits nicely, and they're prepared to pay quite high multiples. They go through a thorough due diligence process, but sometimes selling out to an Australian-owned business will provide a higher return to a local purchaser.
Okay, and do you find that when it isn't Australian, that the same bank will bank the purchaser, that the relationship carries through? I suspect in scenarios where that's moving on to the next generation, say a farming arrangement, that's a given. But where when an independent purchaser comes on, the handover of the business relationship, well, correct me if I'm wrong, but would that support the transaction, or does it not really happen?
I don't see that very often. Absolutely, the same bank tends to continue funding the family when it's an internal family transition. But usually the purchaser will have their own independent banking and financial backing for the purchase that's completely unrelated to the vendor company.
After the transaction is completed, how do you think, once the proceeds have been received, how should business owners think about the next phase? Pete, this is squarely in your wheelhouse. Take us through how you think about that first conversation about, you've got the money now. Let's talk about your future.
It's a challenging area, but makes a huge difference to those that do it well and those that perhaps the outcomes aren't ideal. The first thing is to involve and often there's the main family member that may be involved in the business or has been driving the business through the years. But this is a phase when bringing in their life partner becomes really important in that decision process, because they've, in many cases, they've watched their partner commit so much to the business through the years that this is the time when they want to make some changes. So that's all about saying, well, if we extract this capital from the business, what ongoing quality of life can we maintain over time? And projections can be really, really helpful here, because as we touched on earlier, often people overestimate the amount they might need or are not good at estimating what it needs to be. So showing some models, and there are some excellent models available to be able to say, well, look, if this is the capital that we are investing at this point in time, if this is the agreed risk profile that we're taking, and we're taking 150K a year, whatever the figure is off it over time, what's the future look like? And, they are models. There's nothing guaranteed about them. But it helps the client understand that connection between the capital that's released and their quality of life to come. And so that's And then how that's actually housed, whether it is in trust or whether it's held personally or whether it's in some other entity, becomes a consideration, and that comes down to they're both the legal and the accounting advice that's kind of being received.
Yes, I mean, hopefully a business owner also has some other funds that have been put aside. There's either investment property or there are already some funds under management in addition to the business. I think that the issue we're touching on here sometimes is that if the whole retirement pot is the business sale, then that can be more tricky and more risky. Uh, I quite like the scenario where I'm working with clients and we treat the money coming out of the business sale, that's money to be blown over the next 10 years, to actually just be, that's to be spent in an orderly way. Uh, and and then that 10-year period is delaying having to then turn around and draw out on other investments, sell a rental property or do something else. That can be a nice situation to be in. And conceptually, I find it quite good with clients because the money in the business is often it's been tied up, it's been part of um, their working lives, and there's nothing wrong with blowing the lot, frankly. You might be horrified, but that's actually quite nice. Uh, and that can work quite well as long as there are other investment assets there for the family that are not having to be burned through in the post sale period.
It's not financial advice, but life is for living. So, okay, fantastic. Now, um, Daniel, the after the sale, the other component is often business owners will continue in some form or other involved in the business. Do you, when you're engaging with your clients and doing planning, can you take us through how they think about that? It's hard to suddenly let go. So what are the typical roles that you might see, and how does that shape your advice when you're building a plan for them?
Yeah, I mean, it can be hard to let go, and I think that's partly why it's so important to start the succession process early so that everyone has time to think about what they want and what they would accept. But I guess it really comes down to the nature of the business and what the vendor requires. And often people will be involved for a time, but there's usually an end point to that. Um, and people are usually pretty happy to sort of contribute in that way, but then be gone, have a final deadline by which they need to go, and then they can go and enjoy the proceeds, um, buy the batch or go to Europe or donate to charity. Yeah.
Spend it in an orderly fashion.
Yeah.
So you would see, just there's mentorships, and as I guess you've built all these skills as a professional in your domain, as a business owner, and there's mentoring the next generation of owners. I suspect in the farming space that's particularly strong. And then also there's a sort of a consulting piece where you get called in for particular activities or to support. And then there's also earnouts too, where that before they can might be able to let go. How are there any other sort of machinations of ongoing involvement that you tend to see? Pete and Sam, do you see this in any other form, or have I captured them all?
Earnouts are my pet hate, but because I always see that it leads to litigation and things like that often, or I'd always counsel my clients that it can be a way of bridging the gap in terms of a sale price, but as vendor, you need to be don't rely on your earnout. I mean, you have to be quite realistic about, because you're not in control anymore about how that's going to come through. But hey, in some circumstances, the vendor is absolutely convinced that sort of profit is going to be earned over the immediate post-sale period, and it does work, but it's an area of caution, I think.
Very good. So you've got to the end. We've completed the transaction, and I think that brings us also to the end of our call. So we can all go on our merry ways and off to Europe. It would be nice, but no. Thank you, everyone. Sam, Daniel, Pete. Really appreciate your time today and the insights you give. Obviously, we've tried to keep it at a very high level, and every single topic we've touched on, there's a lot to it. So having good professional advice along the way, be it legal, accounting, or financial planning, is important for any business owner. And I wish you all the best for the rest of your week, and hope to see you again soon.
Thanks, Stefan. Thanks, Peter.
Thanks very much.
Daniel.
Thank you, gentlemen.
New Zealand Funds Management Limited is the issuer of the NZ Funds Active Income Series, NZ Funds Active Inflation Series and NZ Funds Active Growth Series, together the NZ Funds Active Series, as well as the NZ Funds KiwiSaver Scheme, the NZ Funds Managed Superannuation Service, NZ Funds Wealth Builder and NZ Funds Income Generator. For further information or to request a copy of the product disclosure statement for each of these, please contact NZ Funds or visit nzfunds.co.nz. This recording is provided for information purposes only. The information provided is not intended as a substitute for specific professional advice on investments, financial planning, or any other matter. Past performance is not an indication of future returns.